Communication Network. Today we're working with Bruce Clark from Clark & Associates, which thanks for coming in, Bruce. We're really going to be talking about an area that's quite significant now on the global stage around sustainability, particularly in our environment, which is the construction industry, and that's green star accreditation and green ratings for sustainable building development and for site development, etc. Bruce, you've just come back from Australia, where there seems to be a lot of work happening there. Could you tell us a little bit about what you experienced and things?
Sure, thanks, Ashwell. The trip was basically to attend the sustainability conference. It's a world conference with mostly to do with construction professionals. And just before that conference, I attended a short course on the Green Star rating tool, from which the Australian one is derived from the LEED system in America.
Okay.
And South African Green Building Council has now recently adopted the Australian system into South Africa.
Okay.
So it made sense for me to really understand what was going on, and the opportunity presented itself for me to actually do the course while I was over there. So I took advantage of it.
Okay, all right. And what was the quality of the training or course like?
The quality was very good. It opened my eyes to many aspects of what one needs to consider when designing a green building. And at the time that I was there, obviously at the conference as well, one is exposed to many things that we just take for granted. We understand that green buildings are something special and that we have to do things completely differently, whereby in real sense what we need to do is just get to grips with the natural environment and try and localize the things that we are now doing. The world is a global village, and we take advantage of the fact that we can fly materials across the world at will. And if we spend a bit more effort and time using more local materials and understanding our local environment like we used to in the ancient times, and when you look at colonial type buildings where they respond better to the climate as opposed to bringing in artificial interventions which just take up energy.
I mean, that was just not even a couple of 100 years ago we were operating that mode, and I suppose the modern era has taken quite a lot of things out of this process. In terms of the Australians and their implementation of the system, have there been any major challenges that have popped up that they've had to deal with that have really turned their construction industry on its head?
Yes, and I think one of the things that came about from the Green Building Conference that I experienced this year was that the previous one, they only run every 3 years, and the previous one was in Tokyo. And that one was focused really on the basics of what constitutes green building design and looking at all the passive mode systems. And that was a real eye-opener, because it gave you lots of facts and figures, and you could understand what happens in the world at any particular point in time. This conference was focused more on the realities of how you now go about implementing these things, and also focused primarily on the costs. So there was a lot of emphasis on what the benefits would be for retailers, developers, and there were podcasts with international guest speakers. There was one from America, which of course is also an eye-opener, because the Americans are not they're not signatories to the Kyoto Protocol.
Yes,
and up until recently, nor was Australia. South Africa is a signatory, but we're not one of the annex countries where we haven't identified global emission reductions. So now that the Australians have just become signatories, they're hell-bent on making sure that things are being put into place. And there's been a lot of interest, and the Green Building Council has expanded leaps and bounds there. And it was very encouraging to see that things are actually happening very, very quickly. So I think they were up to now nearly 700 applications that are in the system for accreditation on green buildings.
Oh, that's excellent. Well, I think maybe at this point let's actually talk about some of the components of how the rating works. What are the key features that are identified? What makes a green rating? What's the model, the criteria? And can you lead us through some of that?
Okay, the way that it works is it's quite interesting, because recently in Durban we were exposed to somebody that was speaking to us on sustainable design, and it was an interesting observation that there's a criticism about the system in that it's assumed to be a tick box type criteria. And yes, it is based on a point system, and you do get points for fulfilling certain obligations, and they are quite stringent with regard to a very particular way in which the the documentation must be presented so that it's easy for somebody to prove that you have complied with the requirements to be able to get those points. And yes, although it is a point system, I do believe it has a place. We're dealing with commercial activities. We're dealing with people that are going to be spending money, and they want to be assured that what they are actually striving towards, that there's a fairly good chance that they're going to achieve that. And in terms of us, from a risk point of view, if you get a request to have a building designed to try and obtain a 4, 5 or 6 star rating, which are the only 3 grades that get ratings, then one needs to be fairly satisfied that you're going to be able to do that if you follow certain guidelines. It cannot be something that's totally subjective, that you design a building, send it in and hope that somebody's going to come back and say, yes, this is now okay. It's also to the point that you don't want people to believe that because you've now obtained a green rating, that you've got level 4, 5 or 6, that absolutely everything's perfect and that this building is now carbon neutral, and that one would identify with the building and say, yes, that looks like a green building because it's full of plants and because it's made out of local materials and it's mud brick. It's not about that. It's about a responsibility to using less materials to do more. And it goes down to the way in which finishes are used or not used to counter the effect of having many more things in the building, and to try and reduce them and have those things that are only going to provide you with the need of what you want. But for instance, the windows don't have blinds on the inside, rather have them on the outside if you're trying to block out the sun. And it's those simple things that actually make sense to us. They are common sense. But we've lost the ability, and in certain circumstances, like our situation in South Africa, if you put aluminium blinds on the outside, well, they're probably not going to be there for very long because aluminium is valuable and they'll find leaks. But it is obviously the best way to go. And taking into account all those passive things to start with, you then start to reduce the amount of interventions internally afterwards.
So actually, to almost sum up that point, there's a responsibility to design well up front, but also in terms of the monitoring and evaluation and use of that building into the future, you actually still have to remain green. It's not just about getting your rating in place. You've actually got to have the commitment to keep that rating and maintaining it in a sense as well, which I think is excellent. There's a lot of opportunities for that kind of thing because carbon issues and obviously climate change, it's a thing that has to be closely watched and followed all the time. And no doubts our national legislation is shifting towards that monitoring and compliance perspective. And it's great that we've got individuals such as yourself looking at influencing it from the design side, so inherent design factors rather than it being an afterthought kind of issue, which I think has been a criticism of the EIA process as well, is that people get EIAs signed off and they don't have any real environmental management plan off that point. Development gets signed off and they kind of continue on. So it's excellent to hear that they have that monitoring or commitment component to it as well. How long does the rating last, out of interest?
The rating is permanent, so once you've got the rating, it's forever. But the ratings are given on the basis that a particular version of the Green Star rating tool is in place at a particular time. And there are conditions that within 24 months of the building reaching practical completion, one has to have made the application under a particular version. So in other words, at the moment Australia are working on version 3, South Africa has introduced a very similar basis from their version 3, which is our version 1. So in South Africa now, if you apply for a Green Star rating, you would be granted one on the basis of it being version 1, and that's how it stands. So in 5 years' time, with the system evolving, because you have to lift the benchmark all the time. So in 5 years' time, it might be more difficult. It should be more difficult because one needs to start pushing the boundaries, and you can't maintain a standard of that far off the mark of being carbon neutral that people would just continue thinking that that's now great. You've got to keep on pushing the boundaries.
Yeah, and I mean, it sounds like with the Kyoto Protocol, we've missed certain targets, emission targets, reduction targets have been missed, and when I say we, globally here, have been missed. So it's great that they're trying to set the standard high. In your opinion, as a subject matter expert, Bruce, do you think the South African standard is pitched at the right level? I mean, we've got to ask the question. Do you think the guys are aiming at the right level, or are they looking at maybe getting people into it first and then growing the levels and the standards to a higher, let's call it, level of excellence?
The entry level of any system is at the right level when it starts off being something within.
Okay.
And that is what we're about. So it's very difficult to criticize the system and say that it's not pitched at the right level yet, or that it could be improved. Of course it can be improved, and everything is improved as one goes along. The reason that it's correct at this level is because it's actually difficult to achieve these objectives, and you have to work hard at it, and it's a lot of intensive work, and there are cost premiums. So from a point of view of pitching it just so far out of reach that you're trying to pick up on other international standards, it would be unfortunate. So one has to grow the system, and it is a voluntary system. It's not something that's regulated. It's not a law that tells people that you have to do it like this.